Greetings and welcome to Relationships Unfiltered, a podcast about relationships, love, lifestyle, romance, passion, sex, and a whole bunch more. I'm your host here, Rashad Bakir, and welcome to my channel. Just to let you know, this channel is for adults, audiences only. The content and themes are not suitable for young children. So today, folks, we're going to get into interracial relationships. I'm going to break it down for you. It's a very hot topic. Many people out there in a lot of spaces love to talk about interracial couplings and relationships and all that stuff. And so I'm going to give you some good stuff on what my experiences have been and just what is the landscape of interracial relationships. So this topic alone can be its own series. Okay. And so given that, I'm actually going to present it in a series and such. So it's going to be a reoccurring episode that I will cover many aspects to interracial dating, relationships, and the whole nine yards, and so forth. Now, one of the first things, because one of the things that really that people want to really talk about is the dynamic in black and white. Okay, we know that. And so, particularly as it relates to black men and white women. And there is a notable book that was written about that with one of my connects back in the day by Ray John Parshad. It's a book, Why Black Men Love White Women. Okay, see it right there. And so, while I won't go into the particulars of the book per se, what I will do is just give you some aspects to what's happening in the landscape, like I said, as it relates to why black men love white women and vice versa. Why white women love black men and the whole thing, okay? So, but before that part of it, because I'm saving in that part, I'm going to do basically like what is an overview, a state of interracial relationships, and a breakdown to the psychology of interracial dating and what's happening. Now, what I first want to do, though, I want to just kind of give you some clarity as to what I'm going to be discussing and the approach to which we all need to understand in the game as it relates to interracial dynamics. And that's first is there's interracial dating, okay, which is different from interracial relationships. Which is different from interracial marriage, okay? So we all kind of can understand that, right? Now, dating out there, because this is where, because if we're going to look at numbers, and I'm going to bring you some numbers here in a second, those numbers are largely skewed, okay? And they're largely skewed in a way that's underrepresentative of what is the reality. Okay, especially as it relates to interracial dating. So dating is just what it is. You're just dating, you're meeting people, single to mingle, and you're not necessarily in a committed relationship. Okay, so you have a ton of those out there. Hookups, friends with benefits, no strings attached, and the like. Okay, you had all kinds of stuff going on in there. People who are dipping into what's called swirling, okay, interracial dating, and but that's an undocumented, unreported. There's not a data point to that because it comes here, it comes there. I mean, you just can meet somebody at lunch, and that's it, and so forth. So that part of it, can go in a lot of different directions. So the dating aspect of it is a lot larger than the relationships that are out there. And some people come and go in interracial dating. So there are a lot of people who may not be in a current interracial relationship, but has previously been in one. Okay. And then, of course, so when we talk about relationships, we're talking about partners, depending on where you go. If you're in a monogamous one, or you're in a polyamorous one, or polygamous one, or whatever one you've got out there, whatever your flavor is, there's something for something in that. Now, when we look at marriages, and that's where you have a lot more hard data that I will go through to give you a breakdown to it, then we can look at some things with that in terms of certainly with regard to trends and all that other stuff that comes into that part. Now, there's also the fact that what we need to look at with regard to this is understanding that the state of interracial relationships, I get my notes right there, is doing fabulous. It's phenomenal. It's exploding. More and more are we seeing interracial dynamics happening, whether it be dating, whether it be relationships, and certainly marriages. And so I'm going to bring you that. And then additionally, what I'm going to do in the next episodes that you'll have with this is I'm going to look at, like I say, the history, particularly here in the United States. And then also, again, as I mentioned before, the black-white dynamic and all that. Not, again, just to put that in perspective, because there's much more history, there's much more dynamics to that, and all that. So that's why when we talk about the black-white dynamic, why it's such a hit, okay, of sorts. Now, let's look at some of the numbers here. I got some stuff here for you folks. So I already explained dating versus relationships. So what I'm looking at now is the marriage stats, okay? And this is brought to you from the Pew Research Center, which is a very good resource for surveys and data information. So, okay? So let's look at some of the stuff they have here. Interracial newlyweds, okay? So we're talking about newlywed marriages. 9.4% of whites that are newlyweds are in interracial. Now that might be surprising for some people with that data point, that percentage is lower, but I'll explain some things as to why that is. So just bear with me there. 17.1% of blacks, 25.7% of Hispanics, and 27.7% of Asians. Okay, of these groups now we're talking about marry someone outside of their race or ethnicity. Okay, so amongst newlyweds we're talking about. So the newlywed couples, out of all the white couples that married newlyweds, 9.4% of those were interracial. Now again, so why when we look at that, and it might sound like, oh, that's a low percentage, you would think there'd be more. Well, again, it goes into the numbers. So these are just percentage breakdowns. The numbers, as I'm going to explain this a little bit in a minute, of whites, certainly the largest racial demographic. So that number, again, can be skewed in a way. Now let's look at the percent of married opposite sex, heterosexual couples. That would be 19, almost 20% of married couples are interracial, are considered to be interracial, are self-identifying as interracial. And then 31%, just for my LGBTQ people, 31% of those marriages are interracial. So they have a higher percentage of interracial couples in the LGBTQ folks versus the heterosexual folks who are almost 20%. So, and these percentages are going to only increase, folks. Like I mentioned, the number of people who are interracially dating, coupling, relationships, and all that stuff is only growing, and it's going to continue to grow. And as the song said, ain't no stopping us now, because that is where we are here in the 21st century. Now, let's look at some other numbers here. Now, this is relating to cohabitating, so these people who are living together. To what we know, 18% is reported to have a partner of a different ethnicity or race. And again, this is only what is data pointed. So, as I mentioned, a lot of these data points are underreported. So that means that even though it says 18%, there's probably like 20-some% of folks who are living together that are interracial, okay, for factors of which we'll get into. Now, the next one would be what is the most common type of dynamic of interracial marriages? Okay, so when we look at interracial marriages, what coupling types do we see the most in? So let's look at those. That would include Hispanics with white people. Okay, so a Hispanic and a white person accounts for 42% of all interracial marriages includes a Hispanic person with a white person. Okay, 42% of those. The next common group, which drops down a bit, are the whites. All of these include whites. Whites with a Asian person. Okay, so an Asian person, a white person, that's 15%. Okay, so you have that one, and then the next one would be a white person with a multiracial person at 12%, and then a white person marrying a black person at 11%. So just below the multiracial person. And as you see, so the most of the interracial couplings all involve, well, all of them, all of the core interracial couplings involve a white person with a non-white person in terms to the strongest and the highest percentages. Okay, so we don't have a lot of data on, let's say, a black person marrying an Asian person, or an Asian person marrying a Hispanic person, and those numbers, those percentages are way in the single digit percentages, and they're just probably are not as, obviously they're not as numerous as the other ones are. So it kind of really drops off after that point, which might surprise some people, but a lot of it deals with demographics. So let's get to interracial by location. Obviously, in areas that are cities, metropolitan areas, and so forth, where you have a region, say like California, San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, Orange County, in areas like that, New York, certainly bigger cities, you're going to have more because there's more diversity there and more opportunity for people to meet and such forth. So obviously, going more rural areas, not so much. Not that those areas don't have it, certainly they do, but certainly to a more significant lower number and lower percentage, which is common sense to think about. Now let's look at it by age. So the largest demographic are people in their 30s. So those folks would be considered to be what, millennials or something. So you have that group. So obviously, because again, if we were to look at that number of people, that's where you're starting to see the increase really significantly grow. So you have, the late boomers or the January Jones folks, and then you got Gen X, and then you have millennials, and then of course you have the Gen Zers. So each subsequent generation category where you're going to see an increase in both number and percentage of interracial relationship, marriage dynamics, and so forth. So this only points to the fact that we're going to continue to see an increase in the number of interracial relationships, and let alone marriages upcoming. Now, let's look at both race and gender to this dynamic and give you the breakdown there. So amongst white men, 12% are in an interracial marriage. Okay, this is just by marriage. Amongst white women, 10%. And Hispanic men at 26%, Hispanic women at 28%, Asian men 21%, and Asian women 36%, black men 24%, black women 12%. Now, these numbers, like I said, these percentages, so when you look at the number though, because again, and going back to looking at this, you think like, well, white women, 10% of white women, but do you know what the number of white women there are in this country? in the United States. So there's over 100 million of white women. So you take 10% of that, 10%, let's say about 110. The numbers, actually, the birth rate numbers of white females has dropped over the last decade. You're starting to see the birth rate of the white population in general is dropping, but so white females has dropped. I think at its peak it was like 120 million or so a couple of years ago, like 2018, 2019 and stuff. Now that number's dropped down significantly, about 112 million or so white women, white females per se, to that. So I guess that includes all white females from a baby up to an adult. I'm not sure, but nonetheless, if so, that number though is so large compared to black women. Black women number is 21 million. Okay, so again, the number is nearly 4 times as many white women as there are black women. So if you were to take if you were to equal the number, 20 million white women would be the total number of black women in a interracial relationship. That's almost near the same amount of numbers. So that would be a 100% rate of black women versus a 10% of white women. Okay, so that's the thing you have to factor in when you look at this stuff as it relates to that. Now, percentage of Asian women is higher out marrying, which is called exogamy. So you marry outside of your race. If you marry within your race, that's called endogamy. Okay, so if you marry outside, when Asian women have a highest percentage of that, which probably is not surprising for a lot of people anyway. And then you have right behind that, you have Hispanic women, okay, who are at 28%. So again, these are percentages that seem fairly reasonable to the dynamics of which these women, have an openness. So it just shows you that these communities have a strong openness to marrying outside their communities, their ethnicities and their nationalities and so forth, which is great. At the same time, you also see that amongst Hispanic men. Now, the other thing I need to mention in this is that, again, these numbers, as I mentioned, are skewed, but also, too, when you look at Hispanics particularly, there are a lot of people, Hispanic, who also racially identify as white. So you have to factor that in, that if they self-identify as white, and a lot of Hispanics, even if they don't identify as white racially, sometimes you can't necessarily tell that they're Hispanic of Hispanic background because the Hispanic is identified as a racial minority. So they would be white passing, and you have a lot of white passing folks that are either Asian, full Asian, or part Asian or something, and then let alone the number of biracial black people who are racially passing too, with some admixture and so forth, that are included in that index that don't identify. And then, like what you mentioned, as I mentioned before, there was the percentage of interracial white with interracial people at 12%. So those folks, again, of different multi-ethnic identities who are mixed, and etc. So you have a lot of that going on. So again, and generationally, there's a plethora of number of biracial, mixed race, multi-ethnic young people out there. Children, young adults, etc. And those numbers are continuing to increase as well too. So that's only going to add to the mix as it relates to interracial relationships and marriages and so forth. So what you're going to see in this data point that's going to probably increase is, especially as it relates to white and multi-ethnic people being married. So that 12% is going to continue to increase. Okay, so so you have that. Now let's go to let's see, what was my last one. Last one I want to discuss real quickly. And I'm going to take a break in this, and then we're going to come back with a second segment that I'm going to continue in this part as a total video, so you know. Okay, now that's going to be why. Okay, when we look at the approval of interracial relationship dynamics, now let's go back to 1967. 1967 is a very important point to make, because this was the year that the United States Supreme Court struck down the national ban on interracial marriage, even though people were still getting married, because again, you had it in states, different states. And at that time, 3% of marriages were interracial. However, there was a less than 3% approval of interracial marriages and relationships and so forth. So in 1967, you had 3% of marriages that were interracial. Less than 3% were approval by the public. Now, of course, today, fast forward in the 21st century, where interracial marriages are all over the place and it's very much normalized, you have a near unanimous approval rating of interracial relationships, marriages, etc., and a near close to what I mentioned before, where the numbers are in the 20 percentile of interracial marriages today. Okay, and that's just what's reported. So again, they're on top of that, those numbers are boosted up if we really go into the hard identities of what people actually are versus how they identify. Okay, so a lot of this gets into how people identify that factor into those numbers. So it's always going to be higher than what is the reported data point that we have. Okay, now again, so those are those things. Okay, and I'm going to stop here, and then I'm going to come back with my second piece tied to this one, because again, this is going to be some good food for everybody to munch on as I go into the state of interracial relationships here at Relationships Unfiltered. Stay tuned for that break coming back. Thanks so much, everyone.